Welcome back, everybody. Who would have guessed that, in just a week it would be 80 degrees? Incredible. All right, so the second of our investigations or studies of the Joseph story. Maybe we have some new faces here. Do people who were here last time want to maybe say a thing or two about what we did last time? Provide a transition to today's session.
We talked about the dreams.
We did talk about the dreams, yes. You remember how many there were?
4?
6.
6?
Four dreams that were interpreted, given authoritative divine interpretations, and 2 that were not. Right? Anybody else?
If you have a dream twice, it means you can't change it.
That's right. It means it's kind of set in stone, which is very important because who were the figures then that had 2 dreams? Remember? Anybody? Joseph and Pharaoh, right. So, and that's probably key in terms of the plot because Joseph reveals that to Pharaoh in the context of his dreams. His own dreams have not yet come true, but he would know certainly by that point that the dreams he's had in chapter 37 are going to come true because they fit that paradigm exactly. Very good. Anybody else?
We talked a little bit about how Joseph changed over those years from sort of like the spoiled kid to recognizing that even though this bad thing happened to him, that it was part of God's larger plan.
Right. That was the most important theme we traced, I think, last time, was the transformation of the character of Joseph, an individual chosen by God, who has to learn what that means to be specially chosen by God. How is that transformation, in some senses, revealed in the dream interpretation? Yeah.
At the beginning, he's talking about how he's going to rule over his brothers, and by the end, he's acting as a servant leader.
Yes, he's not interested in the brothers bowing and scraping before him. At the beginning, it looks as though the only thing on his mind is the desire to dominate his brothers, and his brothers fear that, in fact, that's going to be what happened. Let's look at that dream just once more as a kind of transition into what we're going to do today. That's in chapter 37, if you want to turn in your Bibles, because everything really centered last time on the way in which this dream was misinterpreted by Joseph and his brothers, in the way in which Joseph understands the dream at the end of the story in contrast with how he understands it at the beginning. So in chapter 37, verse 5, I'll read with respect to my translation. Yours will probably vary a little bit, but the ideas will be the same. Once Joseph had a dream which he told his brothers, and they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream which I have dreamed. And they were binding sheaves in the field when suddenly my sheaf stood up and remained upright. And then your sheaves gathered around and bowed low to my sheaf." His brothers answered, "Do you mean to reign over us? Do you mean to rule over us?" And then the brothers, as we noted, rightly hated him all the more. And then we contrasted that dream with the very end of the story, very important, perhaps the most important verses in the entire Joseph story in chapter 50, if you want to turn there. In this chapter, at the end of the story, Jacob, the father of the 12 brothers, has just died, and the brothers have carried his body back to the land of Canaan to bury it. And the brothers are in fear that Joseph now is going to seek revenge on them now that the father has died, because after all, the brothers did try to kill him at the beginning of the story, a rather serious crime both in the ancient world and in our world, I think. So the brothers, quite leery of Joseph's intentions, we read in verse 18, it says, the brothers went to him themselves and flung themselves before him. So they're literally enacting the fulfillment of that dream, right? You know, to a T. And they said, you know, not only do they enact the posture of a slave, they say those very words, we're prepared to be your slaves. But then Joseph responds, have no fear, am I a substitute for God? In other words, God's slaves, of course, can be translated also as servants, and it's appropriate, of course, to bow before God as a humble servant. Joseph feels that's not appropriate for him. Am I a substitute for God? And then the key line, verse 20, although you intended me harm, you intended to murder me, God utilized your intentions for the good. That's really maybe one of the most important, the profound points that comes out of the Joseph story is the fact that God's providential designs, that is to preserve this family through the famine, is enacted through all of these horrible decisions that the brothers freely make. So although you intended me harm, God intended it for good so as to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. And so fear not, I will sustain you and your children. That's really the key line. Joseph realizes that the privileges that have been shown him were not calculated to gain him power over his brothers, as seems to be enacted there in verse 18, but rather all the privileges that have fallen his way were simply to serve one purpose and one purpose alone, that of sustaining, and here really it means feeding, right, his brothers. So if we go back to that very first dream, which we looked at last time, I mentioned it was very significant that of the 6 dreams in the Joseph story, these first 2 are the only ones that go uninterpreted in any explicit sense, and that's because they're interpreted wrongly, or certainly this first dream is interpreted wrongly. Does anyone remember what we suggested perhaps was the true meaning of this first dream? The binding sheaves in the field, Joseph's sheaf stands up and theirs bow low.
That it was a grain sack that was full, and grain sacks that are full stand up, and those that aren't collapse.
Collapse, right. So this image, if we read it through the lens of chapter 50, could speak not to the point that Joseph is going to have power and the brothers are not. The brothers are to grovel and he is to simply revel in the glory they give him, but rather his sheaf stands up. I mean, the brothers are going to meet him with bags of grain because he's in Egypt with lots of grain. His bag will be full and it will stand and remain upright. The brothers' bags, when they come to Egypt, will be empty, and empty bags, both in the modern world and in the ancient world. Think of the Martin's bags, the plastic bags you get at the grocery store. They stand up miraculously if you fill them with stuff, right? But if you take the stuff out, they just collapse on the counter. Well, it works the same way in the ancient world. The bag simply sits there on the ground. And that's what I tried to suggest was the meaning, or should have been the meaning. In this, of this dream, the problem in the story is that Joseph and the brothers are too immature to recognize, at least at this stage of the game, what God intends to do through this family. So last time we followed, Joseph quickly through these 14 chapters, and we can see the enormous changes that he undergoes. He begins the story as an arrogant, spoiled young man, presumably unworthy in every sense of the honors that have been cast his way. But by the end of the story, after much struggle and hardship, we can see that Joseph has matured in an extraordinary fashion and is more than worthy of the office that he came to hold. So today what we're going to look at, and won't be able to finish this theme today, we'll continue on to it next week as well, is the transformation of the brothers. Because that's really what the whole story is about, the transformation of the whole family, of how they will grow into the roles that God has appointed them for. And I intimated last time, one of the reasons this story is so important in the Bible is that in some senses it's a biography of the people Israel. And it's important to know, I think, the names and the genealogy are here, just reflecting that. Jacob, the father of these 12 young men, his other name is Israel, just to make that crystal clear. And frequently in the Bible, especially in the prophets, but also in the Psalms, you'll hear the term the God of Jacob, which is synonymous for the God of Israel. Jacob, as you may know, was the second-born son, but the preferred, his brother Esau, was the firstborn. And that continues something that's deeply embedded in the book of Genesis too, is the preference for the second-born. It's going to be related to Jacob's two wives, Leah and Rachel. He will prefer Rachel, but she'll be the second-born. And that theme will continue all the way down to Joseph's first two children, Manasseh and Ephraim. Manasseh will be the firstborn, but Ephraim will be the preferred. And then within the context of Jacob's children, Joseph, at least initially, is the last child. We could put, a line in some respects between Joseph and Benjamin, because there's quite a hiatus in time between the birth of Joseph and Benjamin. Benjamin will only be born several chapters later. So for a time, Joseph is the youngest of the siblings, and he is the beloved. According to the logic of the book of Genesis, he's beloved because he's the latter-born son. In terms of the story of Jacob himself, Joseph is going to be beloved because he's the firstborn of his preferred wife, Rachel. Leah is the one, as we observed, who is the more fertile of the two. Rachel initially was barren, and then both Leah and Rachel have maidservants, Bilhah and Zilpah, through whom the other children are born. It'll be very important, especially to note the relationship of Joseph and Benjamin as brothers, as we're going to see today, because once chapter 37 has come to a close and Joseph has been sold into slavery and thought by Jacob to have died, and by the rest of the brothers eventually, they believe he's probably died as well, because being sold into slavery in the ancient world was pretty much tantamount to a death sentence, not immediate, but slaves weren't expected to live too long. So the brothers, as we'll see, especially in Judah's speech, Brother Judah, in chapter 44, he'll say outright that Joseph has died. So from the perspective of the family, Joseph is dead. And that means Benjamin now has assumed the role of the favorite son of Jacob. That's exceedingly important for noting how the story will unfold. So with that, those few brief points in mind, why don't we turn to chapter 41. Chapter 41 begins with the story of the dreams, which we went over last time. We won't do that again. We're going to look near the end of the chapter here, in which the famine is about to begin, and the years of plenty, the years of plenty are in process, and the famine is about to begin. So why don't we begin here with verse 44. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, yet without you no one shall lift up hand or foot in all of the land of Egypt. It's kind of remarkable. One of the features of Joseph, if we look back, is every place he lands on his feet, and people immediately see this is a guy that you want to have at your right hand. Everything comes out well if it's placed in the hands of Joseph. Pharaoh then says in verse 45, he gives him a new name. Here we have an Egyptian name, Zaphanath-Paneah, a name that Bible readers until the modern era had no idea what it meant, since the discovery of ancient Egyptian with the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. Now we have an idea of what that name would mean. Mine has my Bible translation has a footnote at the bottom that gives us two possibilities of what this might mean in Egyptian. God speaks, he lives, or creator of life. It'll be interesting in a moment to see what Jerome does with this name. No one here probably has a Dewey Rames translation in front of them, I'm assuming. No, so you won't have. I'll tell you what Jerome says in a moment. Anyway, so Pharaoh gives Joseph the name Zaphanath-Paneah. The rabbis actually have a very interesting understanding of this name. This frequently happens in rabbinic Hebrew. These two words come into modern Hebrew, even though they're Egyptian in origin. Zaphanath, well, we get the Hebrew word sophan, which means code, would be like your password for a computer. And Lufaneach means to solve. So the name means code solver, riddle solver. It's not hard to imagine why the rabbis would have seen that as the meaning of Joseph's name. They got that just contextually from what happened before. He's the dream interpreter, so it would be altogether appropriate that Pharaoh would give him a name that would match what he's done, code breaker. So Pharaoh gave, well, we're going to see Jerome does something slightly different. Contextual as well. Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphanath-Paneah, and he gave him for a wife Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, the priest of On, and thus Joseph emerged in charge of the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Leaving Pharaoh's presence, Joseph traveled all the land of Egypt. That's an important fact too, 30 years old. Do anyone remember how old he was when we began the story? 17, very good. So 13 years have passed. How long will it be until he sees his brothers?
14? Wasn't it 7 more years?
At least 7 more. So there's going to be 7 years of plenty, and then maybe 8 a year into the year of famine, 21 perhaps. He's not going to see his father again, probably a few years after that. So you can see why the family has presumed he's dead. The amount of time that's passed is going to be pretty extraordinary. The separation from the family has been extreme. So, beginning verse 47, then during the 7 years of plenty, the land produced in abundance, and he gathered all the grain of the 7 years that the land of Egypt was enjoying, and stored the grain in the cities. He put in each city the grain of the fields around it. So Joseph collected produce in very large quantity, like the sands of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Egypt in the ancient world in general was known as being an extraordinarily rich agricultural mecca, in part because it wasn't dependent on rain the way much of the rest of the Mediterranean world was. The Nile River, for the most part, was extraordinarily dependable. It was one of the reasons why the Romans wanted to occupy Egypt, to have access to its great grain-producing capabilities. And we can see during these years of plenty, this is by no means unusual. Egypt is producing grain in extraordinary numbers. In fact, we have a number of artistic depictions from Egypt itself. A lot of textbooks, in fact, a lot of illustrated Bibles will sometimes reference these, that shows Semites from Syria, Palestine coming into Egypt to buy grain. So the story that we have here in the book of Genesis, we can't prove that it historically happened, mind you, but there is a kind of historical verisimilitude to the notion of people from the land of Israel going into Egypt during time of famine to survive. Then, getting to verse 50, before the 2 years of famine came, Joseph became the father of 2 sons, whom Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph named the first Manasseh, Hebrew verb nashah, to forget. And so the reason given here, God has made me forget completely my hardship and my parental home. Just remember that line when we turn the page to the next chapter. God has made me forget completely my hardship and my parental home. And the second he named Ephraim, meaning God has made me fertile. Para in Hebrew is the word to be fertile. God has made me fertile in the land of my affliction. The 7 years of abundance that the land of Egypt enjoyed came to an end, and then the 7 years of famine set in, just as Joseph had foretold. There was famine in all the lands, but throughout the land of Egypt there was bread. And when all the land of Egypt felt the hunger, the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph, whatever he tells you, you shall do." Accordingly, when the famine became severe in the land of Egypt, Joseph laid open all that was within and rationed out grain to the Egyptians. The famine, however, spread to the whole world, so the entire world came to Joseph in Egypt to procure rations, for the famine had become severe throughout all the world. Okay, especially in light of those last few verses. Now it's time to reveal what Jerome did with verse 45 above, this name, Zaphnath Paneach. He translated it in Latin, Salvator Mundi, which would mean Savior of the world, right? Why do you think he did that?
It's right here that all the world comes to Joseph. For
To be fed, right. To be fed, that's right. Now this is an extremely important, I think, part of the book of Genesis, because if we turn back to Genesis 12, keep your finger in 37. Someone here, let's see, maybe I'll call on Amy Shalid. You want to read the first 3 verses of chapter 12?
Sure. The Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse him that curses you. And all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you." Okay,
so it's the last verse that's going to be of interest to us. But this is the story of the very famous story of the call of Abram, the call and election, the choosing of Abram, who will of course later be named Abraham. And in it is grounded, of course, the choosing or the election of the Israelite people as a whole. And what's important to know is how this chapter fits within the overall narrative shape of the book of Genesis, because we've just ended chapter 11 with the Tower of Babel story, which in many respects is the end of what has been 11 chapters of the gradual decline of humanity. Chapter 12 is really the turning point in which God wants to save the world through the calling of this one individual, Abraham. It's always been a surprise both to any form of Bible reader. Why Abraham, and why does God limit his gaze in terms of saving the world to this one family alone? But as chapter 12, verse 3 makes clear, what God intends to do is to channel blessing to all the families of the earth through the selection of this one particular family. Now, the book of Genesis and the Old Testament, by and large, is not a religion of conversion. So the idea, certainly within the Old Testament itself, of spreading the blessing of Abraham to the peoples of the world is not to make everybody converts to Israelite religion. The idea of conversion comes very late in the day, at the close of the biblical period. But we can see the type of universalism that the book of Genesis and the Old Testament, by and large, has here in the Joseph story, with this the sending of Joseph into Egypt to preserve, as the story makes it quite clear at the end of this chapter, the entire world from famine, right? So the choosing of Abraham, which is going to lead to the choosing of Joseph, is calculated to achieve a bigger aim than merely the betterment of this one family. It's through this one family that the world itself will derive blessing. And according to the Joseph story, it's through this family that the whole world, lives. Because without Joseph in Egypt, not only will Joseph's brothers and father die, but according to the logic of the story, everybody in Egypt dies. So there's a lot riding on this individual. There's a strongly universal dimension to the Joseph story that frequently Bible readers, I think especially Christian Bible readers, don't always appreciate, because we think of universalism, at least in terms of religious message, as being convertible solely into the idea of conversion, proselytization. That's not the book of Genesis's notion of the universal reach of divine choice. This is really the notion of the universal reach, is that the entire world is going to benefit tremendously from what God is doing through this one person. And so I think, though it's obviously wrong from the perspective of the grammar or the semantics of verse 45, I really like Jerome's translation of the name of Joseph, because I think it catches very nicely the tenor of this chapter and the extraordinary quality of the Joseph story as well, that what God is doing with this family is not simply with respect to this family alone, but with respect to the rest of the world that comes in contact with this family. Okay, with that in mind, let's turn to chapter 42. Like I said last time, at any time you want to stop and interject something, question or comment, please do. Maybe I'll just stop here for a second and see if anyone wishes to.
There was something that struck me as you were reading it, when it said, do what he tells you, talking about Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
And then immediately I was thinking of the Feast of Cana.
Yeah, so Joseph is Christ-like here as Jesus is at Cana. Well, next week, if we have time, there's a homily by a medieval Cistercian monk comparing the Joseph story to the story of Jesus in the New Testament. It won't all fit, but there's an amazing amount of details that do fit. One strong theme, actually, that does fit too, can't remember if he mentions this, but basic certainly to the Easter liturgy. The Exultet that's sung on Holy Saturday is the lines, the Felix Culpa, O necessary fault, the praise, of course, in inverted quotes, that for Adam's sin, that it would bring us such a Redeemer. At the end of this book of Genesis, in essence, Joseph is saying the same thing. You intended to murder me, but thank God you did intend to murder me, because I wasn't going down to Egypt on my own recognizance. And if I hadn't got down there, we would have all died anyways. So it doesn't, in the Bible, that doesn't exculpate the brother's moral lapse. In the Bible, you can have it both ways. God can use the moral lapse for his better benefit, but the culprits still are responsible for what they do. But the notion that God redeems the people through Joseph's suffering does, and it's a necessary suffering, does call to mind a lot of elements in the story of Jesus as well. And it may have been precisely points like that that also motivated Jerome to understand his alternative name as Salvator Mundi. Anybody else? Okay. Let's take a look at chapter 42. Now we're going to see a little bit different Joseph than we saw in chapter 41. The famine has broke throughout the world. Certainly Joseph must know now that his brothers are going to come to Egypt to seek food, because everybody is going to have to come to seek to Egypt to seek food for themselves. So it begins, when Jacob saw that there were food rations to be had in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you keep looking at one another? Now I hear," he went on, "that there are rations to be had in Egypt. Go down and procure rations for us there, that we may live and not die." So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to get grain rations in Egypt. For Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, since he feared that he might meet with disaster. What does that tell us about the relationship of the father to the sons in this family?
Protecting that last one, right?
He's the favored son, right? I mentioned that Benjamin would become the Joseph stand-in. And we saw earlier that the 10, well, what leads to Joseph's demise is that the 10 brothers are out herding the sheep, and Joseph is at home with his father. Clearly an indication of his father's special preference for them. They're exempted from the work that the other brothers have to do. And here we can see that the same situation is at play, so that Benjamin is, in some senses, the alter ego of Joseph. I like to think of what's going to happen over the next couple chapters as analogous to one of my favorite movies, Groundhog's Day. You know, where Bill Murray wakes up every day and it's the same day, and in some senses, chapters 40, what we'll get to next time, is a kind of Groundhog's Day moment. In other words, Joseph is going to be orchestrating the interactions among his brothers, so that the same kind of crisis that necessitated his murder in chapter 37 will reappear with respect to his brother Benjamin, and it will be by virtue of that that Joseph will be able to learn whether or not his brothers in fact have changed. Just as in the Groundhog's Day, we witness the extraordinary change actually in Bill Murray as the movie moves along. And we'll see extraordinary change in the brothers too, through this somewhat theatrical representation to the brothers of the situation that the family had faced in chapter 37. So let's move down to verse 6. It says, "Joseph was the vizier of the land, and it was he who dispensed rations to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and," what does your Bible say? Knelt down. So there we go. There's our, pardon me? Bowed low, right. Right. Bowed low to him. So is what I have. And there we have fulfillment of the dream, right? At least initially. What appears to be fulfillment of the dream. But of course it's not the fulfillment that was probably the deeper structure of the dream, nor the fulfillment that Joseph ultimately desired. But here things are a little bit different. Joseph's brothers came, bowed low to him with their faces to the ground. And when Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he acted like a stranger toward them and spoke harshly to them. So we as readers have to wonder, is this kind of going to be payback time for the brothers? Is Joseph going to use their extraordinary vulnerability now in front of him to seek redress? And in fact, that's exactly how the story is going to initially unfold. He asked them, "Where do you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan to procure food." For though Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. And recalling the dreams that he had dreamed about them, Joseph said to them, "You are spies, and you've come to see the land in its nakedness." But they said to him, "No, my lord, truly your servants have come to procure food. We are all of us sons of the same man. We are honest men. Your servants have never been spies." There's a kind of irony there to verse 11, right? We are honest men. Because technically, the brothers are right? They've been accused of being spies, and they're saying, no, we're honest men. But, we as readers, of course, know that they're telling this to Joseph, the individual that they attempted to murder and then lied to their father about, right? So that line, "we are honest men," cuts two ways within our text. Honest, yes, with respect to the immediate question on the table, but quite dishonest in terms of why they're in the particular position they are in. "And he said to them, 'No, you've come to see the land and its nakedness.' And they replied, 'We, your servants, were 12 brothers, sons of a certain man in the land of Canaan. The youngest, however, is now with our father.'" So from this, Joseph can see why Benjamin's not there, and he also can infer that the relationship of Benjamin to his father is the same as what his relationship with his father. And then the telling line, "one is no more," presumably a euphemism for death. Joseph, of course, knows that. That's him. And Joseph then said to them, "It's just as I have told you, you are spies. By this, however, you shall be put to the test. Unless your youngest brother comes here by Pharaoh, you shall not depart from this place. Let one of you go and bring your brother, while the rest of you remain confined, that your words may be put to the test, whether there is truth in you. Else by Pharaoh you are nothing but spies." And he confined them to a guardhouse for 3 days. I didn't bring the Hebrew text with me. I should have. You have Hebrew text?
Yeah, we have.
I'll have to see what the word for guardhouse is here. What verse is that? Guardhouse, right there, verse 17. Oh, no, that's 17, right? So there we go. No, Mishmar. Oh, that's fine enough. Yeah, that doesn't tell us enough. A place of being guarded. Well, what I was going to say, I mean, whether it works this way or not, typically when one is put in a prison, for example, when Joseph is put in a prison in chapter 40, it's a pit. Prisons were frequently pits. That's what Joseph, of course, was dropped in chapter 37. We don't have to necessarily go that direction with respect to verse 17, but the parallelism stands irregardless if it's a guardhouse or if they are put in a prison like a pit. What Joseph is doing is giving his brothers, in some senses, the very same treatment that he received in chapter 37. So as we see this chapter at least begin to unfold, we're really not clear just how Joseph is going to react to this situation of his brothers being in front of him. And we can see that unlike what he said in chapter 41, he said in verse 51, if you remember, he named his first son Manasseh because God made me forget completely my hardship. Well, we can see that he hasn't forgotten it at all. Of course, he probably wasn't imagining perhaps seeing his brothers face to face, but now with them face to face in front of him, Joseph is a human being like all other human beings. It wouldn't be easy to get over attempted murder, right? That's not.
Well, you look at the second child's name, and you already figure out he hasn't forgotten it either, though.
Right.
You don't keep naming it. What's the second
Ephraim.
one? It says, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction.
My affliction.
So he's
That's
still,
right. Right. That's a good point. That's a good point. He's not there by choice. He's not there by choice. That's right. So, but things turn in verse 18. On the third day it says, Joseph said to them, do this and you shall live, for I am a God-fearing man. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers be held in your place of detention, while the rest of you go and take home rations for your starving households. But you must bring me your youngest brother, that your words may be verified and that you may not die. And they did accordingly. They said to one another, alas, we are being punished on account of our brother. That's certainly true, more true than they can imagine. Because we looked on at his anguish, yet paid no heed as he pleaded with us. It's a kind of a painful moment to recall, and it's not actually, we don't actually learn this in chapter 37. Let's go back to 37 when they drop him in the pit. If we... take a look at it. Verses.
Sat down and had a meal.
That's right. No, we're going to come to that. It's very important. Verse 23 says, when Joseph came up to his brothers, they stripped Joseph of his tunic, and they took him and cast him into the pit. And the pit was empty, and there was no water in it. These pits typically meant they were a cistern in which you stored water, and so the walls would be a straight vertical, and they would frequently be plastered so that they could hold water. But because they were plastered and they were a straight vertical, there was no way you were coming up out of the pit. So frequently in the Psalms you will have individuals describe their being healed or saved or delivered as God drew me up from the pit. Later will become an image also for the underworld, because if you were dropped down, you weren't getting out on your own power. It was only by some external agency that you were going to get out. So they drop him in the pit, and this pit was a cistern without water, so his days, maybe even his hours, are numbered. And then, as I think you mentioned, the next line is extremely important. They sat down to a meal. It's an indication of the utter callousness. They pulled out their peanut butter sandwiches or whatever they had, a bottle of wine, and had a party. Yes, I mean, that's not an incidental little detail. In the Bible, you'll find this frequently in Proverbs and Psalms. There's nothing worse one can do than to rejoice at the demise of someone else. That's a horrible, horrible crime to be accused of. Something that all football fans know too. Kind of over-celebrating is thought to be taunting the other side. It's a dangerous thing. There's a reason why it's not allowed in the rule books. And that's what the brothers are doing here. It's a kind of taunting of their opponent. But here we learn something we didn't know from 37. It's even worse than that. It's not only that they dropped him down there with no water and sat down to have their sandwiches, but their brother was crying to them while they were up there, right? So the scene is really heart-rending. So we're being punished on account of our brother because we looked on at his anguish, right? I mean, it's one thing to arrange matters such that someone suffers, but it's real cruelty to be there and to look on and to enjoy it, you know, while you do it, right? That's a matter of a different order altogether. We looked on at his anguish, yet paid no heed as he pleaded with us. So here we can clearly see a sign of the brothers' transformation. That is why this distress has come upon us. And then Reuben spoke up, "Did I not tell you? Do no wrong to the boy, but you paid no heed." And Joseph has been listening to all of this, and presumably is not unmoved by what he's seen. We can see he was not unmoved because it says in verse 24 that he had to turn away and weep at this sign of the brothers' contrition. It says, then he came back to them and spoke to them, and he took Simeon from among them and had him bound before their eyes. And then Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain, return each one's money to his sack, and give them provisions for the journey. And this was done for them, so they loaded their asses with rations and departed from there. Okay. Any comments on or thoughts on these verses?
It's kind of interesting that Reuben was the one who was sort of standing up for Joseph and kind of had this idea that he was going to get him out later from the cistern, and he's like he's the firstborn, right? You know, so you would think he would have been able to get his way, or whatever, you know, but then here he when he chooses to take one, he takes Simeon rather than Reuben. So maybe there was that.
Rather than Reuben, yeah, that's interesting. My the notes in my Bible suggest the reason for that. That as Leah's second son is Simeon, so that's the appropriate hostage for Benjamin, who's Rachel's second son.
It also says here, right here, it doesn't, that Reuben, Joseph presumably doesn't know that Reuben had tried before.
Right.
But here this comes
here he
out,
learns, yes.
And Joseph understands what
right.
they're saying.
No, that's a very important piece to keep in mind as you read the story, read this Bible story. One of the challenges for someone who knows the story real well is that you don't, you think that all the characters know what you know. And you sometimes have to work doubly hard when you read the Bible to try to enter into what their, limited frame of reference is, because that's very important for how the story unfolds. Very important. Yes?
There was something else that struck me when he accuses them and says, "You're spies." And I thought, oh my gosh, that's what he was. He was the tattletale. He was spying on them, so he accuses them of exactly what he had been doing.
Well, that's
And the
very
family
interesting.
thing.
Not thought of that. That's right. He was definitely that.
He's
And-
giving them the family traits.
Right, right. No, that's a good observation. I'd never thought of that. Yes?
I've never really known what to think of Reuben in particular, because I know he plans to save Joseph and gives him the idea of throwing him in the pit rather
Right.
than killing him. But then they successfully sell him to the Ishmaelites. So
Right.
I never knew if Reuben was, felt for Joseph but was sort of uncourageous, or if...
I think what it says, as I recall 37, is that they thought he would talk them into throwing him in the pit, and then he would return later and get him, retrieve him, which then does not eventuate, because this often happens, they throw him in the pit, and then, circumstances simply go in a direction that he couldn't have foreseen. And
He comes back and sees that Joseph isn't in the pit,
They've
so
done
he
this in his
apparently was not
absence.
part of the group selling.
right.
Well, we don't, he wasn't part of the group that cast Joseph into the pit.
But if he had sold it to the Ishmaelites, he would have known that he was no longer in the pit,
Yeah.
not been surprised.
Yeah, he's
So-
surprised in verse 29.
So he would not have been
Right,
part of that.
right. He says, returning to his brothers, he says, the boy is gone, obviously, distressed. What am I to do? So Reuben is, of all the brothers, innocent. Yes?
It says here,
What
and their
verse?
container, I'm sorry, the 42:25.
Uh-huh.
Gave the orders to have their containers filled with grain, their money replacing each one's sack. So he's
Right.
giving this to them for free. He's
That's
not
right.
accepting the payment. So just seeing the connection there, they profited, received money for selling a brother into slavery. And so just seeing what you're saying about the sort of recreation of the conditions where by giving away a brother, they profit rather greatly.
That's right. That's a very important motif, I think, as we get to the end of this chapter. When they empty their sacks, you'll see in verse 35, they'll see, now, if I got home and all my money was in my Martin's bag along with my groceries, I'd think, happy day. Although I have to say, last year wouldn't you know this would happen? I was living in New York. I was on my way to Mass. This is like the only time I know it's going to happen in my life. I looked down on the sidewalk and there's a $20 bill. So my first thought is, is there someone around who just dropped it I can return it to? There is a shred of honesty in me, not much, but there is a shred of honesty. I can't just take this. So I looked around, did my 30 seconds due diligence, and I said, well, someone's going to pick this up. It might as well be me. But I was going to Mass, so I'm in Mass. I think I have to put this, I have to put this
in the collection.
I can't keep this. I thought, why would I find this on the way to Mass? Why couldn't I have found that on my way to work? Or I would have said, I'm just going to go out to lunch today. Why would that be? That seemed, very unfair providentially. When is the next time in my life I'm going to find a $20 bill, on the sidewalk? Anyways. So the point is, I'm sorry, I was distracted. The point is here at the end of the story, they're dismayed. Why do you think as the brothers open their sacks and their father sees the money, they're dismayed? Really, Lenny, you've already answered the question in some senses.
Like a setup.
Yeah,
Yep.
does
How-
that say something about Jacob's sort of enduring suspicion, perhaps?
Right, that presumably the brothers sold. They've sold him, right? Because every time, in some sense, that is how Jacob lost Joseph. was due to the shenanigans of the brother, and now it looks as though he's lost Simeon through perhaps similar deceit, and what's going to be very difficult for Jacob in the very next chapter, which we'll look at next time, is he's now going to be asked to give up Benjamin, right? He's going because they can't come down and get grain again unless they send Benjamin, which is going to put Jacob now in a real pickle, because giving up Benjamin for Jacob is going to be a risk of the highest order. And on that note, I think I'll stop and we'll rejoin the matter next week.